spring transfer portal window is officially open. Let's talk about it. How much craziness can we expect? Joining us now is our good friend, Brandon Huffman, national recruiting editor for 24/7 Sports, at Brandon Huffman on Twitter. Today on their YouTube page on 24/7, they have a Transfer Palooza portal show going on, so you can keep track of all the names, everybody jumping in, how it affects your team and all that. Brandon, first, good morning to you. Second, we've heard a lot of hey, brace yourself. This is going to be insane. It's going to be crazy. Brace for impact, basically. I know it's early on in the day, 8 o'clock here on the West Coast. Has it been as crazy as we expected? A little bit less? About the same? More? How has it gone so far in your eyes with the transfer portal?
My colleague Bud Elliott just tweeted out, he said, I was expecting fireworks, and so far we've gotten sparklers. And I think that that's probably an accurate description. I mean, if you think back to the first day of the portal in December, we woke up to the news. I was on the East Coast, woke up to the news that Kyle McCord, who had just won 11-1 and had Ohio State driving for a potential Big Ten, title spot, was going into the portal. Those were the fireworks we were expecting this morning. Other than Caden Proctor, officially going in, it hasn't been nearly as loud as we thought it was. Now, that's not to say it's not going to. It just hasn't been as rambunctious a start as maybe we expected it to be, given how December went.
Do we have a crystal ball or idea where we think former Oregon State running back who pledged his loyalty when Jonathan Smith snaked out of Oregon State just hit the portal, Damian Martinez? Do you have an idea of where you think Damian's going to land?
I've heard Ole Miss, I've heard Miami, I've heard Michigan State was a potential, just given the relationship, though I don't think that that's as serious as it may have been. They kind of got a head start on some other running backs in the previous months, but I've heard somewhere down south. And I think, the way his agent has been tweeting and some of the people that have been involved there have tweeted, there's going to be a pretty handsome, connection when he gets to whatever school he so chooses. But that one, absolutely, the way he so vehemently denied any possibility of leaving to then pivot so quickly, that's kind of where we're at in college football in 2024. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's some guys that have said, I'm not going anywhere, and then they go anti-Wolf of Wall Street, and they end up bouncing.
Anti-Wolf of Wall Street. That's a great
That's
visual.
exactly what happened, though.
I'm not leaving. I'm leaving!
And then he gets out and he makes the pledge with the feds. Hey, actually, I'm leaving. That was
I'm on my way out. I'm curious to ask you this, Huffman, because a lot of fans kind of roll their eyes this time of year. Rosters are poached. Big fish are eating little fish. And there's a lot of bad faith actors. And you mentioned agents, and there's money involved in trying to entice, other schools for bigger contracts. But the reality is, for a lot of these kids that enter the portal, for some of them, there isn't the home that they're expecting. Some of them have to go down a level or to a smaller school. It doesn't end up having the net result that many of these kids imagine. Now, Caden Proctor, Caleb Downs, they're the outliers. I don't ever expect the NCAA to get rules in place here to reset this thing and have some sort of guardrail. Do you think there will ever be, from the kids' perspective, a course reaction? I'm seeing a lot of guys who are jumping in the portal today who also entered the portal and just committed in December to a place, and now 4 months later they're transferring again. Are kids smart enough? Will there ever be a course reaction, or is this just going to be chaos for year in and year out?
I think eventually it'll regulate itself. I think eventually there will be some, guardrails in place to keep it from happening. Remember, too, it's not just the guys that are choosing to leave. A lot of these kids are being encouraged by the coaches that are there, whether they were the coaches that recruited them, whether it's a new staff that came in. They're being encouraged to look elsewhere. But who takes all the shrapnel on social media? Well, it's certainly not the new assistant coach at my university, because I love him. He could do no wrong, even though we said the same thing about the previous coach who just left, which we're seeing all across college football. And, keep in mind, too, we had an inordinate amount of coaching changes happen post-January. Usually they happen right after the regular season. They're happening at the end of November, early December. But you had such a trigger and chain reaction with Nick Saban's retirement. 5 or 6 schools affected by that, 3 of them out west alone. Then you had the Chip Kelly departure right after signing day. So you're having these late departures of coaches that are triggering guys. I mean, think about how many guys transferred to an Alabama or to a Washington or to an Arizona only to see their coach leave a week later. And that's why you're seeing guys that went in January maybe coming out in April. You're also seeing guys go in January thinking that they're going to have a starting spot. They were given this NIL contract based on if they were the starter, then they get the spring ball, and now they're running second or third. They need to go somewhere where they can play and where they can get on the field. And so there's a lot of things in place. But my question has been, and I've said this for the 21 plus years I've been covering recruiting, why do the coaches always get a free pass when they leave year to year, day to day? I mean, how many times have we seen coaches spend a year at a school and they're at their 8th school in 8 years, but the kids are the problem for leaving? Let's remember that the adults are a lot of times the reason these guys are being forced into the portal.
Well, I'd add to that, too. I think you're spot on. I think it's hilarious. These people get mad and they make public comments, and then the athletic director of Washington's there for a cup of coffee and then bolts for Nebraska. And it's like, you are the example. Look how you're acting on it. I want to ask you, talking about coaches, it's been well documented. Dabo does not portal. He's not a portal guy. He hates the portal. He can identify his own talent, and he'll develop them for 2, 3, 4 years. I ask you on the recruiting trail, is this hurting Dabo? This reputation of I don't want cast-offs, I do it my way. They haven't had that title success in a couple years. How do you think it's working out for Dabo? Is this hurting him on the recruiting trail, this reputation of not taking in any portal players?
It is, because then that becomes a negative in the recruiting trail. Hey, they're not going to take care of you. They're not going to get you NIL to get you there. You come here, we're going to have the NIL that'll take care of you. And that's what's becoming the forefront of players' choices. It's not the player development. It's not how am I going to get to the NFL. It's not am I going to have a chance to win a championship. It's what's my NIL payday going to be. Now, the flip side of that is if you look at the 4 teams that made the playoffs this last year, with the exception of Washington having a very high-profile transfer in Michael Penix, the core of that team at Washington was players that were signed by the Huskies and developed there. The core of the team at Alabama and at Michigan and at Texas. I mean, yes, Quinn Ewers was a transfer from Ohio State, but he was technically a Texas commit in the beginning. All 4 of those schools were schools that developed their players and didn't have a high dependency on transfer. So I think Dabo, if he had a quarterback that was functional and not being compared to the Trevor Lawrence, Deshaun Watson types, but, DJ Uiagalelei in a vacuum, he had a decent career at Clemson, but he didn't play like Watson or Lawrence. It's almost like Clemson's a really functional quarterback and offensive coordinator away from being in title contention. But now the further you get from those titles and the more you double down on being anti-portal, anti-NIL, the more that's hurting you, especially as we're now expanding to a 12-team playoff. So, yes, I think Dabo needs to get into the 21st century and not be stuck in the teens, because it's no longer just about signing the best players and developing them. You don't have time to develop them anymore, or they're going to bounce.
Yeah, it's wild, wild stuff. Brandon Huffman is our guest, 24/7 Sports national recruiting editor at Brandon Huffman on Twitter. I've seen randomly Louisville's lost a bunch of guys today. I don't follow Louisville too closely. I'm just curious, of the losers so far in this transfer portal window, who kind of jumps out from a team perspective, and then who do we see as like the shark swimming around in the water, smelling blood, trying to come after some of these kids? Like, who are the losers, and who do you project to be some of the big winners?
Well, I think Miami and Ole Miss are 2 schools that have made it very well known that they're going to hunt in the portal and they're going to add players from their, to their roster from the portal. I think Miami's made zero chill about that. I mean, that's been one of Mario's big sayings is how much he's hit the portal. And Cam Ward is kind of the poster child of this recruiting cycle. But they did lose a player today, Logan Sagapolu, who actually signed with him at Oregon. He went into the portal. So you're seeing some guys that go to what they think are greener pastures, but then other guys in the portal become more attractive. So it wouldn't be a surprise if Miami loses a few, but then gains a few. Louisville obviously already taken a hit. I would say there's a couple schools like a Colorado State, which, on the season didn't have the greatest success, but has a lot of really good individual players. As Jay Norvell gets things cracking there, they already lost a very talented receiver today in Justice Ross Simmons. It won't be a surprise if a school like UCLA, which, was able to kind of withstand the departure of Chip Kelly and nobody went into the portal during that 30 days, it wouldn't be a surprise now that there's a full staff in place, a couple of guys left. So I wouldn't be surprised if, a Washington or an Arizona. I mean, there's all kinds of rumors that Arizona is still being hit by Washington, guys that played and were recruited by Jed Fish, potentially following him to Washington. They kind of weathered that storm in January. So I'd say keep an eye on those schools that have had those post-January coaching changes as schools that could really add to their roster, but also could take a hit from their roster because those are now guys that weren't recruited by that current staff.
Yeah, Brandon, the realignment gives us weird new rivalries and matchups, and one of the obvious ones for us out here is going to be when Ohio State comes to Eugene. Chip Kelly's an OC for them now. It's a massive game, and it appears Dan Lanning, Ryan Day are squaring off for a few years to come if Ryan Day doesn't get axed for not winning a title in the B1G. I'm curious from your standpoint, How do they compare, and how do you view this competition now where this stuff just used to be on field for most of us? And then the U's of the world started highlighting the importance of recruiting, and you're on websites that matter, and you're like, hey, this kid's going to this place, and we start following this. The battle off the field between Ohio State and Oregon, what do you make of it now that they're conference foes?
I think it's fascinating because you go back to when the 2020 game was canceled because of COVID, and then in 2021, Oregon goes into Columbus and beats Ohio State, and that ends up being the only loss Ohio State suffers until they lose to Michigan, kind of starting the Ryan Day can't win the big one thing. And, the irony is I've heard somebody refer to Dan Lanning as West Coast Ryan Day because he's winning, but he hasn't beaten his rivals, but one time beating Oregon State. So, hey, maybe that is a great matchup, but both those teams are killing it in recruiting with the high school players. They're both doing a fantastic job of getting key parts in the portal. Ohio State getting a Caleb Downs, getting a Will Howard. Oregon obviously getting Dylan Gabriel and Dante Moore. So they're both gearing up for immediate title runs. I mean, it wasn't lost on anybody that in their first year as part of the Big Ten recruiting rankings, Oregon ends up with the highest rated class. The Big Ten Recruit of the Year, Junior Adams from Oregon. So already Ohio State getting a strike across the bow from Oregon. I am fascinated to see how this becomes kind of one of these newfound rivalries that we're going to find. We saw it early on, remember, in the SEC when Texas A&M went down into Tuscaloosa in year one and beat Alabama, and it kind of launched Johnny Manziel's Heisman train. Right off the bat, Texas A&M and Alabama had a rivalry when Alabama and Auburn had their rivalry forever. Are we going to see a new regional rivalry based on rankings, based on just because the perception socially, social media and publicly is that Ohio State and Oregon are the new rivals? Do people forget about Michigan? But I'm already fascinated by how those two teams are facing off and squaring off, basically trying to figure out who's going to be the Big Ten champion and get that first round bye.
If this was Celebrity Deathmatch, Judge Mills Lane, let's get it on. Who are you choosing? Who is your Ryan Day? West Coast Ryan Day, Dan Lanning, or actual Ryan Day? Who is your fighter?
Hey, I might be a Southern California, I might be a West Coast guy, but I'm taking the defensive guy every single time in a fight. So I'm going with West Coast Ryan Day. I'm going with Dan Lanning because if you're going to get a DC, they're always a little bit crazier than offensive guys. There's always a little bit extra nuts to them. So I'm taking that guy in the fight.
I don't know if I should be excited or offended by these comparisons. I'm kind of conflicted right now. He's a great coach, but I understand the analogy. Should I be upset? I don't know. Quickly, Huffman, do you expect Oregon to be active in this spring window?
I think they will, but they're only going to be for certain parts here and there. Not going to be nearly as active as they were back in January, but there might be a player or two here, a position or two here that just might be that one key missing ingredient that if they can get somebody that can come in and be ready to play and contribute right away, they may add a player or two here. But I don't expect them to be as busy. Oregon's one of the few major universities in college football that still wants to win based on what their recruiting class in high school ranks looks like.
What do you guys got coming up today? I know you're busy. You got YouTube stuff going on. What can people expect at 24/7 today?
Yeah, we're going to be, we've been covering the portal since about 6 a.m. Pacific time. There's going to be news flying out all the rest of the day. I mean, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. West Coast. And a lot of these West Coast kids aren't even awake yet. So they haven't even had the chance to tweet how they're forever a such and such, even though they've only been there for 4 months. There's a lot of notes apps being worked on right now. A lot of graphics getting dropped out throughout the rest of the day.
Yeah, I hate to tell these kids, but
those.
when the picture gets tweeted, nobody reads it. They're like, well, he's gone.
He's gone.
He's gone.
Yeah.
I love that they're for 8 months. Once of this, always of this. Like, were you really? I don't know if that really works. Brandon Huffman, at Brandon Huffman on Twitter, national recruiting editor, 24/7 Sports. Go check out their great stuff on YouTube all day. The website, they're going to be all over it. The spring portal is open. Thanks as always,
Thanks,
man.
Huffman.
We appreciate it. Let's chat again soon.
Let's do it, guys. Thanks a lot.
There you go. Brandon Huffman. Really good stuff from him on the portal and just the craziness that is to come. And so far, at least, it's early. It's 8:18. We got to remind ourselves we get up very early. It's not the middle of the day, but not fireworks. We got sparklers.